Hey, Geoff, do you like pizza?
Yeah, broadly, I would say I'm a fan of pizza. I
Okay.
don't know very many people who aren't a fan of pizza in some capacity. Even people, I have a few friends who don't like dairy or who are lactose intolerant. Even they still like pizza, however. So it's just variations of it, or there's certain kinds of cheeses that are better for whatever. There's just people who like. I think pizza as a dish is comes in a lot of different varieties in a lot of different styles, and
That's for
that way,
sure.
a lot of people can enjoy it. Yeah,
That's
whether you're
right.
vegetarian or what have you.
I know if you had said no, we probably would have just ended the episode here, I think. It wouldn't have been worth it to go any further. So a follow-up question then to that rather simple question is, what is a good pizza judged by, in your opinion?
For me, so I mean, I have some pretty strong opinions because I wouldn't say like I think there are people who broadly just love pizza, right? And
Mhm.
they're going to love all kinds of pizza, whether it's their local fast food chain, Domino's, Pizza Hut, what have you, or something fancy. For me, I look for something that has a good amount of sauce on it.
Okay.
Because to me, the cheese is almost an afterthought, right?
Okay.
I want the bread and the sauciness and the garlickiness of it all, and then there's the toppings, of course, and the cheese. Uh, but those are kind of like extras, right? Those are the things that come on top. It's like I want there to be a nice sauce ratio compared to everything else.
So very fundamentals have to be correct. Yeah. I
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that you're not alone in having strong opinions on pizza. I think that's like a pretty common thing, particularly in the United States. And a lot of what we'll talk about today is regional variations in the United States. But, controversies are widespread. Some people get sort of bent out of shape if somebody else is eating a pizza they don't like for some reason. The considerations include, as you mentioned, the crust is really important.
Mhm.
The mere presence or absence of sauce, because some have sauce and some have red sauce and some have something else, whether there is sauce or some kind of fat like olive oil put on top of it. The toppings is where we get into really pretty strong debates. At what temperature and how long it should be baked. I mean, all these things people have opinions on with regard to pizza. And of course, it's not the only food that is subject to this kind of debate. But I think with pizza in particular, geography is often at the heart of the debate.
Yeah. I mean, as you're talking about sort of toppings and people having very specific opinions on specific toppings, the one that immediately jumps to mind is pineapple, right?
I knew this would
Pineapple on
come up.
pizza.
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah,
And that obviously is associated with a very specific place,
right.
which is Hawaii.
That's right.
And so like the geographies at play, that go into also the opinions that people have about different kinds of pizzas, whether it's Hawaiian style or I don't know, New York style, Chicago style, Chicago is also, I know a lot of people have a lot of opinions about deep dish and whether that's, we'll probably get into it, but about whether that's technically pizza or not. I've seen people say that it's actually more of a meat pie or something like that. I'm like, I don't know.
Some people
It's all fun.
feel so strongly they don't think something deserves to be called pizza, perhaps. And people might say, hey, that's not how it's made in Naples, or that's not how it's made in New York. And so that's not really pizza.
Right.
Or how could you eat pizza with pineapple on it kind of situation. It's not just that you're neutral. It's like, oh, you like what you like. I like what I like. But sort of almost being offended that exists as a topping on pizza.
Right.
I think that's one of the more controversial ones. I don't want to really stake a claim on that, but it's interesting that it seems to raise emotions when people are talking about toppings on pizza. I should also say before we go any further, full disclosure, that I have pizza industry experience. I don't know if you know this, but as a teenager, I worked at Little Caesars.
Oh, interesting. No, I didn't know that. And I didn't know, well, I guess this would have been a while ago. Does Little Caesar still exist?
It does still exist. In fact, there's one probably 3/4 of a mile from my house.
Oh, wow.
I don't frequent, I'm sort of, it's the love-hate thing when you work as a teenager at a place. And I sort of have the same thing with Dunkin' Donuts. It's sort of,
Right.
flashbacks and this kind of stuff. But this is a place, Little Caesars, where you don't make odd numbers of pizza. You only make, or maybe they do now, but at the time it was always like double pizza. So you're making 2 or 4 or
Right.
6 or 8. It was never 3 pizzas or 1 pizza. Where I worked, there were a bank of phones, like push button phones on the wall. And if one rang, you answer it, and then it would jump to the next phone. And there was no place to put the phone. There was no button to put it on hold. So if you were working the phones, you might have 2 or 3 phones receivers in your hand, and you couldn't mute the other person. You're just sort of taking everybody's order, and it was sort of set up for chaos. This is what things
Wow.
were like back in the day. And I remember it well because it was the summer of the Mitza special.
Mitza.
Yeah, so it had, I
I'm
believe it
guessing
had
a meat pizza.
meat pizza had ground beef, sausage, bacon, Canadian bacon, and pepperoni on it. This was the special. And I would make people order it by name. I'd say, yeah, I want to get your meat special. I'm like, which one are you talking about? The meat special. I'm not sure which one you're talking about. Mitza. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So I kind of have people have to go into it. So anyways, I do have some industry background here I wanted to come clean on. I was looking for statistics because a lot of times we like to introduce some statistics about how things are working nationally and globally. And I found them kind of hard to come by. And I did find some, but I wasn't 100% confident like where they even came from. So I'm not going to go into too many of them, but I did find one that seemed to repeat it in a few places. So I will at least broach, and I don't know how dependable this is, highest per capita consumption of pizza by country. I have the top 5 here. I'm wondering if you have a guess as to what is on that list.
I mean, my first guess would be the United States has to be number one. I know obviously Italy is sort of the place that pizza is, most closely culturally attached to.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, like Pizza Hut, Little Caesars that you talked about, right. Domino's, these massive now global chains,
That's
right? Pizza Hut, you can find Pizza Huts, and you can find Pizza Hut in Europe and in Italy.
So Italy is
that would be my guess.
Italy is on this list at number 5.
Okay.
Germany is number 4. The United Kingdom is number 3. Now, again, this is where I would be guessing the United States would be first. Apparently it's second, according to this information I found.
Really?
I kind of find it hard to believe, but apparently the country with the highest per capita of consumption is Norway. I'm not, I don't know. It's a tough one for me to take in, but apparently in Norway, it's mostly frozen pizza. Like frozen pizza is enormously popular there.
Okay. I mean,
in volume, it's the United States, I think, but in terms of per capita, it might not be. I read a statistic again, don't know if it's true, that on average, 350 pieces of pizza are eaten every second in the United States. This actually seems low to me in a way, but
that seems pretty low to me.
Yeah, that's an average throughout the day, I suppose, but yeah, it seems low.
Like I could see that being a statistic for just New York.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So again, I'm extra beat of caution with grain of rice with this particular grain of salt with this thing. But let's talk about how long people have been eating pizza. I mean,
okay.
We've been eating pizza our entire lives, but how long have people been eating pizza? And it's kind of hard to say. Did people in ancient civilizations eat pizza? And they probably didn't eat the kind of pizzas that we're talking about and that we're thinking about. However, they all consumed flatbreads embellished with toppings, which sounds kind of like pizza. That's kind of what pizza is.
I've made this similar argument for the sport soccer, right? Soccer is a pretty at its most basic, it's a pretty fundamentally rudimentary sport, right? There's two areas you're trying to get a ball into, and people are going to kick it and try and get it, right? So it's not surprising, as if you start tracing the history of soccer back, you're going to find variations of that exact same idea that go way, way back before the modern iteration of soccer.
Across civilizations.
Pizza seems,
yep, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Pizza seems very similar, right? It's flatbread with a sauce on it,
right?
Of some sort. It doesn't even need to be tomato sauce.
No,
it can be any kind of sauce.
It could be anything, right? In fact, there is some speculation that pizza might go back before recorded history. Now, the reason we don't know it is because it's not recorded. That's what recorded history is. It's stuff that's written down. So that goes back to maybe 5,000 BCE in Mesopotamia, 3,200 BCE in Egypt, that we have a written record of things. But there are other ways to sort of discern history. And so apparently Egyptians made flour from wild grass seeds as long as 14,000 years ago. So this would have been at the dawn or the pre-dawn of agriculture. So maybe they made flatbread out of it. And maybe they put something on top of it and stuck it on an oven or a hot rock for 11 minutes. I mean, that's a possibility. So this may have gone on for a long time.
I wouldn't even say it's a possibility. To me, it's like pizza is Pizza is just a way of eating bread.
Right.
It's all it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. No, that's a good way of
And
putting
bread
it.
is one of the bread is one of the oldest sort of staple foods that humanity has had since agriculture has been around. And so, yeah, I mean, it makes so much sense. Like, yeah, we don't have any record of anybody doing this, but somebody probably did.
I have to believe
at some
that
point.
people have been eating pizza for over 10,000 years. I mean, it's
Yeah.
got to be true. As for recorded history, for what we know, as back as 2200 BCE, Egyptians made flatbread topped with a doa, which is a kind of mix of crushed nuts, herbs, and spices. So that's very pizza-like. Around 3,000 years ago, Assyrians in Mesopotamia ate a thin dough topped with meat. That sounds like pizza.
Sounds very pizza-like.
I found a few sources that claim that the Greek geographer and historian Herodotus wrote about Babylonian recipes that sound kind of like pizza.
So I think this is now Herodotus's 5th episode in a row, not just total, 5th episode in a row that he's made an appearance.
I know this might seem forced, but I actually stumbled across this. So yeah, it's there for us.
Nobody expects Herodotus to appear, and then there he is.
And then he's eating pizza. So
yeah,
let's see how long we can keep going with that. In Egypt, proto-pizza goes way back as well. Apparently, a baked, round, seasoned flatbread was frequently served at the pharaoh's birthday. So the pizza party itself seems to be thousands of years old. Like that. What do you have on your birthday? You have pizza. I mean, the pharaoh had pizza on his birthday. It's amazing, right? In Italy, flatbread goes back to around BCE. So that goes way back as well. And from about 930 to 730 BCE, Etruscan Greeks and Persians made flatbread type situations that were pretty close to modern pizza. So this has been going on. It's well grained. Let's jump ahead, though, to the industrial age, right? We're going to jump way back to the industrial age, and we're going to find ourselves in late 18th century Naples, also known as Napoli. This is where we track pizza from today. And this is where we consider pizza to be the origin from, even though there might be all this other stuff. Like your soccer analogy, I think, was a good one. Like it may have been something similar to it might have been done someplace else, but this is the way we're able to track it.
And this was like probably when it was starting to be marketed as the entity that it is today, right?
Yeah, and I think it was maybe called that even at that point. It was pretty contained to Napoli for a while. So this is in the southwest Campania region, of which Naples is the capital in this part of Italy. And at this time, Naples was one of the bigger cities in Europe, right? So it was definitely, throughout medieval times, it was this city-state, huge center of trade. Fishing was a big industry there. And then once you get into the 1700s, the population starts to grow very dramatically. So between 1700 and 1748, the population nearly doubled to 400,000 people. And as the city grew, of course, one of the things that happens is that the amount of people living in poverty grew as well. And so pizzas were sold by street vendors and became a very cheap and convenient meal for the poor. So this is interesting. This is kind of the story we told about how sushi began. It's
right.
Street food that was not fancy, that was versatile, easy to eat on the run, and people ate it in the streets. So it's a folk cuisine, the way it starts out.
It's funny though, because unlike sushi, which I think at least here inside the United States has become more associated with, I would say, sit down, fancier sort of restaurant, I would say pizza still holds to that historic legacy, right? Just hopping into a place. I mean, you can get fancy pizza if you want, but like, how often, like, I'm walking home from wherever and, there's like a pizza by the slice place and I'll hop in, I'll grab like a slice for a couple dollars or $3. I don't know how much they cost, and then I'll keep walking on home.
Yeah. I mean, it's a famous thing. And I remember living in San Francisco and doing the same thing. And I would try to get back to this place in my neighborhood before it closed, which was like 2, which was pretty late. But I mean, that was a place where you could get a bite to eat, after you're out for the night. And it would be 1 o'clock in the morning or something. And there'd be a bunch of other people there too, lining up, getting a slice of pizza. So one of the things that pizza has going for it is that it uses a lot of inexpensive, readily available, and flavorful ingredients. So if you change the ingredients a little bit, you're changing the taste. So you could eat it over and over again. It's not exactly the same every time. The simplest and most common of these flatbread pizzas at the time were topped with garlic, lard, and salt. Very simple. A slight change in toppings, of course, would give you a bunch of different tastes, including horse milk cheese, herring-like fish, or basil. So those were also popular items. And then some had tomatoes on it. Now, tomatoes, Geoff, you know where tomatoes are native to?
Oh, I have no idea where tomatoes are native to. I've never really thought about that. I would have assumed probably Italy.
Yeah, no, it would seem like that from our association with red sauce and Italy.
Yeah,
But tomatoes are
absolutely.
from the Americas. They're from South America, Central America, and the part of North America that's Mexico today. So those tomatoes had to get to Europe at some point, and apparently that happened around 1548 that they showed up in Italy, in Tuscany first.
So two things. One, this is very similar to the potato,
Right.
which happens to rhyme with tomato. And I don't want to make that, I don't want to suggest that there's a pattern here, but I think that's funny.
Conspiracy
So I just want
theories
to call it
start
out.
with simpler things than this. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I also think it's funny that so there's a really fun map out there, a funny map, I should say, where it's basically there's a map of Europe, and then divided. There's like a line that's sort of dashed line across Europe, and on the north side it says potato Europe, and on the south side it says tomato Europe, and
Okay.
it's really funny. It's like that's how it gets divided, right? Because you get to like Spain and everything, and
Right.
Italy, and there's more tomatoes being used. But you get to Germany and obviously like the UK and Ireland and everything. There's more potatoes being used.
Yeah, there's a
I just thought
similar
that was so
line
funny.
between the kind of grains that dominate. So it's wheat in the
Right.
south and rye in the north, and some interesting dividing lines there. But as you were saying, a lot of people associate, tomatoes, well, they've always been part of Italian cooking. And of course, that's not true because it didn't get there until the 1500s. The tomato became particularly popular in southern Italy, where it was called pomodoro, which translates as golden apple. And initially, tomatoes were dismissed by the high class in a similar way to potatoes. Now that you mention it, there's a lot of similarities there. By the way, listener, we did a double episode on potatoes, so go check it out after. But
Absolutely.
people were suspicious of this, and the wealthy in particular. And so it wasn't particularly popular with the wealthy. And as a result, they weren't particularly expensive. And the low cost was one of the things that was really attractive to the poorer classes. It's like, hey, this looks good. We'll eat this. We can afford this. And so eventually it makes its way onto pizza and into pasta as well. The tomatoes in Naples, I want to point out, are grown in rich volcanic soil, which gives them this very distinctive sweetness. And a lot of people will only make pizza sauce from canned tomatoes from Napoli, for example, because they think that that's the way to do it. That's the proper way. And there is, I think, some debate as to whether it became a common topping on pizza in the 18th to the 19th century. But once it did, it stuck pretty hard. And of course, I think a lot of people make that association today. Let's talk more about Italy in the 20th century and its connection to pizza after we take a short break.
Great. We will be right back.
And we're back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about Geography is Pizza, and we're talking about how the modern version of pizza arose in Naples, in southern Italy. And if we go sort of move our story from the 1900s to the 20th century, I'm sorry, from the 1800s to 1900s, after Italian unification, apparently King Umberto and Queen Margherita visited Naples in 1899. So right before the turn of the century. They were used to very complex French specialties, and they decided they wanted to try something local. So a local pizza maker came by and prepared 3 types of pizza for them. And one was the one with lard, horse cheese, and basil. The other one was with little fishies on it, kind of the anchovy type things we might think about.
Okay. Anchovies. Yeah.
And then the other one was tomatoes, mozzarella, and basil. So, Geoff, my question to you is, which of these do you think was Queen Margherita's favorite?
I'm going to guess the one that's named after her, the Margherita's pizza.
Yeah, so
if I had to throw it out there.
That's where that came from, right? Yeah. So, I mean, this is, I think, part of what makes the food get a higher profile, too, is if the queen likes it, it's probably okay. I don't think it instantly becomes popular all over Italy after that. But, it's a regional specialty that eventually does migrate from place to place as people from Naples move from place to place. In the 1930s in particular, more and more people moved away from Naples in search of jobs. This is at a time when Italy was increasingly industrializing, which catalyzing the movement of people from rural areas to urban areas, and then also to other parts of Europe and eventually to the United States and Canada as well. And so Neapolitans are moving, they're bringing their culture, they're bringing their cuisine, and they're bringing their notion of pizza with them as well. During World War II, a lot of the Allied soldiers who were stationed in Europe and in Italy became very enamored with pizza because, again, it's a very easy thing to eat, very satisfying. And so following the war, there was more affordable air travel. We've talked about this in another episode. And that contributed to an increase in tourism, and restaurants throughout Italy beginning to offer regional specialties, not only from their own region, but perhaps from other regions as well. And as this happens and sort of pizza takes root in different places, new ingredients are used and local tastes and preferences are taken into account. And pizza becomes very popular throughout Italy after World War II. It wasn't that it wasn't eaten, but it becomes very high profile food, spreads throughout Europe, becomes popular in Europe. And Neapolitan pizza, I think today is still sometimes used as the standard for what might be considered an authentic pizza. Now, I'm not a fan of the word authentic because I think who gets to call something authentic, right? It's such a political moment right there. You get to call something authentic. But I think the comparison is often to the Neapolitan pizza, which is kind of a very simple, flat crust, thin crusted kind of pizza.
And I'm assuming this is this the kind of pizza that eventually gets exported to like New York?
It's funny you should say that because that is the next thing we want to talk about here is pizza coming to the United States.
Well, I had another thought before that too, because, not to just keep bringing it back to our potato episode, but there's another sort of parallel here whereas that the soldiers who were traveling through Belgium at the time, in the World War II, were introduced to French fries. That's sort of how French fries became such an American United States treat, and elsewhere as well. It was because of these soldiers bringing back this idea, and they were only called French fries because the Belgians were speaking French. They were from Wallonia.
I appreciate the distinction there and the nuance you bring to this, because not everybody knows that fries, French fries, frites, they're actually from Belgium. So that was well done. I appreciate that. Yeah. Shout out.
I've been to the French Fry Museum in Bruges. So
okay.
I'm well aware.
Okay, interesting. Not even in the French-speaking part, but still claimed by the entire country.
Part, yeah.
So let's talk about pizza in the United States, and we're going to kind of focus on this now because pizza becomes something else in the United States, and it doesn't get adopted immediately by everybody. So in the early 20th century, pizza is kind of known as an Italian-American dish. It's seen maybe as exotic. It's seen maybe, derisory kind of, this is ethnic food or something like that, which is this way that people used to talk about things. But within, several decades, it becomes referred to as an American food, if not a symbol of the United States itself, similar to your fry example. So it goes from being not, more something that Italian immigrants are eating and to something that everybody's eating. There are a lot of varieties that we're going to go into here, but the standard U.S. pizza, the sort of standard commercial U.S. pizza, I think compared to the Neapolitan pie, has a lot of tomato sauce, probably more sauce, lots of cheese oftentimes, and lots of toppings as well. Sometimes there's heavy amounts of toppings on these things. This is not true everywhere, but this is generally a thing. The United States, people also have done things like make pizza on bagels or English muffins. So people have adjusted it and adapted it to various things.
Oh, when I was a kid, I used to eat so many of those little frozen bagel bites or pizza bagels. I don't remember what they're called. But yeah, they were so good. I mean, I'm sure they were not very nutritious. There probably isn't actually anything of value in them, but they were very delicious, especially for a 10-year-old Geoff. Right,
absolutely. And then that you could eat multiple of them made you feel like you were eating multiple pizzas, and that was pretty satisfying.
Absolutely,
as well.
Yep. Absolutely.
But of course, there's also many local and artisanal types of pizza, like fancy pizza, craft pizza, if you will. And so we'll want to talk about those things. In past decades, pizza was called pizza pie in the United States. I think that's still the case, probably less so from its peak in the 50s and the 60s, but you still hear that, right? Pizza pie? Maybe not as much.
I would say it's probably pretty rare.
Okay, my
If
East Coast bias is showing here, maybe.
if I do, it's probably on like a menu at a restaurant
Okay,
that is probably of the fancier variety. But
right.
like if I'm stopping in at my local sort of pizza place and I'm just grabbing a slice, I don't see the word pizza pie anywhere.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I just feel like maybe in the Northeast where I grew up, people would refer to it a little bit more often as a pie, or even just a pie. If you were going to get a pie, it was usually understood based on context that you were going to get pizza and you weren't necessarily going to get an apple pie or something like that.
I think that would hold up out here.
Okay. Yeah. So
If somebody told me I'm going to go get a pie, I'm like, great, get something with some key lime in it, and
right,
I'm all over
exactly.
it.
I suppose that's probably increasingly true, but apparently there was a time in the United States where pie was very widely used. So as the United States urbanizes, Italian restaurants and pizzerias spread throughout the country, and initially to places with large manufacturing industries. So when we get into the regional pizza styles in just a little bit, we'll get to explore some of the ones we'll explore are the cities that were very large manufacturing areas, and that's where pizza really took off in the United States. We were talking about before the break how after World War II, pizza gained enormous popularity throughout Italy, throughout Europe, and the same thing happened in the United States. So after World War II, soldiers who served in Europe, in Italy and elsewhere, had developed a taste for pizza, and this helped catalyze the new interest in pizza across the United States. And of course, things were changing in the United States. People, not everybody, but generally there was a bit more affluence and people were more mobile. And the idea of eating on the go, something that doesn't necessarily even exist in a lot of countries, became really popular here. And pizza kind of lends itself to that.
Right. I mean, this was, I guess I don't know if specifically when like McDonald's or whatever started, but it definitely seems to be a hallmark of that 50s
Yeah.
era.
I believe it was
right. I can
in
see
the
like,
50s for McDonald's. Yeah,
yeah,
pretty sure.
like that iconography, right? That
Yeah.
like the image, I can see like old images of it in my head of like this, very 50s style sort of fast food thing.
Yep.
And this seemed to be like one of the catalysts for like, hey, just on your way home, everybody has a car now and you're living out in the suburbs,
That's
just
right.
swing by, pick up some food. And I could see how pizza lends itself to that. In fact, I would say pizza probably ends up being one of the most mobile, foods, for lack of a better word, just because I think it was the originator of sort of the home delivery food, or at least it was in my head.
Yeah, I think that might be the case. I mean, that's kind of what I'm basing on here. A couple things happened in the 50s, 60s. One of them you're talking about is that pizza delivery becomes a phenomenon. The other thing is that frozen pizza, which we mentioned in the context of Norway earlier, becomes a thing. Tombstone Pizza began in 1962, and then in 86 it was sold to Kraft Foods. So, when Kraft is buying something, it's well accepted and really widespread. And so frozen pizzas, of course, are big in the United States. And several large pizza chains also started in the 50s and the 60s, many of them from the Midwest and Western states. And many of them were started by individuals who were not of Italian heritage. So this becomes a business enterprise for people that aren't reaching back into their own past culture in order to make something traditional. They're thinking, well, this is a popular item. This is a popular food. We can make a good business off of that. In 1960, the brothers Tom and James Monahan established a pizza shop that delivered in Ypsilanti, Michigan, called Dominic's. And in the 1970s, they began to go national and they changed their name to Domino's.
I was going to say, once you said Dominic's, I was like, that's got to be Domino's. And if it's not, it would have been really funny had it turned out to be Pizza Hut, but I wouldn't have put money on that.
So the big hook that they had going was pizza delivery. And I think, as you pointed out, this might be where the whole delivery craze in the United States, at least, and probably other places, really gets going. And then the other thing is fast delivery. I mean, that was really emphasized pretty strongly as well. The 1980s saw dramatic growth in Domino's franchises. So in 1977, there were about 200 of them. And then by 83, there were over 1,000. So massive, rapid expansion into Canada around that time as well. And you might not remember this, but I'm old enough to remember that one of their big advertising hooks and slogans was 30 minutes or your pizza is free. Were you part of that era?
I I've heard of this and
Okay.
I've seen this idea riffed on, sitcoms and like stand up acts and
Yeah.
everything, right? Like this is like a common thing that people sort of pull up. And I've never actually seen this in practice. And I would never have thought that I would have thought it originated from more of like a mom and pop pizza shop somewhere, that was like, okay, we know how to do this. I would not have assumed that a national chain that has very little actual control of what's happening on the ground would allow for something like that. That's pretty incredible.
Well, and it fits because the car culture in the United States in the 50s and the 60s starts to expand. We talked about this on many episodes. We talked about the interstate highway system and how cars become really favored by people in the United States. It gets sort of related to freedom. And so somebody had the idea that we can drive these things around and get people on these new highways and new roads. We can get people pizzas.
Mhm.
There's a reason why it was probably not a thing at the time that you were, able to order pizzas on your own and stuff. And that's because in the 1980s, there was a dramatic rate of accidents for Domino pizza drivers. Like this has been apparently documented that people were getting into accidents because they had to get the pizzas there as quickly as possible. And Domino's tried to emphasize, that it's the making of the pizza that will be fast. But ultimately, it's like, all right, you now have 12 minutes to get this to this person's house. Otherwise, you have to
Right.
give it to them for free.
I'm 99% sure that if a driver didn't make it within that 30-minute window, there was definitely some who were going to face repercussions by their managers
Right.
or owners of the
Yeah.
franchise or what have you. And so, yeah, how could that not end up being the case? Because it's like, well, either this pizza's coming out of my own pocket or I'm going to run through this red light or whatever, right? Whatever it is, or I'm going to speed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is true, but that the death rate of Domino's pizza delivery workers were like on par with like coal workers or something like that. The death rate,
Oh my
like
God.
it was really bad. And then in '89 and '93, Domino's was brought to court by a couple families who had family members that were injured, in one case killed by a driver, and Domino's lost those court cases. And so they had to back off of their fast delivery promise, and they had to sort of bank on other things. But Domino's is famous really for delivery, I think, more than anything else.
Yeah, and this might be a hot take, but I would say of the national chains, I would say Domino's is probably still the best.
Okay.
I'm not a big fan of Pizza Hut. I hope I'm not scaring off any potential sponsors. Or
Right.
hey, Domino's,
Right.
we're right here.
In case Pizza Hut's listening, I will say I have a little bit of soft spot for Pizza Hut because it was the one place in my town growing up where you could go as a teenager, like kind of late. Like they were open till past 11 sometimes.
Oh, nice.
And so
Mhm.
we ended up there just because it was open. And if we weren't going to one of the local diners, then we met at Pizza Hut, and I'm sure they loved us. But yeah, that was what was going on. Domino's was sold, incidentally, in 1990 to Bain Capital for $1 billion. So that turned out to be a pretty good business. The first Pizza Hut, since we're talking about it, opened in Wichita, Kansas in 1958 and was subsequently sold to PepsiCo, I believe in 77, for $300 million. So I'm sure in 1990 it was worth a lot more. Pizza Hut has expanded internationally, as has Domino's. And Pizza Hut even expanded into Russia in 1990. Famously, Mikhail Gorbachev was on an ad for Pizza Hut. However, it didn't really take off in Russia, apparently. Too conflated with the United States, perhaps. I don't know. I know that pizza's popular in Russia, but not Pizza Hut.
This is interesting because I had heard that, and this maybe there's a future episode in this at one point, but because you said Pizza Hut at this time was sold to Pepsi.
That's right.
I know now it's part of Yum Brands, which is like KFC and Taco Bell and everything.
Right.
Like
sometimes they're all paired together, or
yeah,
there's a trifecta of these places.
But so I had heard that Pepsi was the only American brand soda allowed under the Soviet government.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that whole thing collapsed, and then all of a sudden Coca-Cola was there and everything like that, Coca-Cola became much more popular because it was more associated with sort of this newfound freedom that, everybody was experiencing at the time. I don't know if this is true. This is something I've heard or read anecdotally through articles.
Right.
And I'm wondering if Pizza Hut's association with Pepsi at the time could have been made them feel analogous to sort of that old brand. I don't know.
I wonder. I had a map at one point that showed the global dominance of either Coke and Pepsi in countries around the world. And there's a very interesting geography to it. And I don't know if it's changed, but it was very informed by the Cold War. And Coca-Cola used to be bottled in US military bases throughout the world. So they would send the syrup and they would use local water and they'd bottle it there. So Coca-Cola was seen as so intrinsically American, in part because it was tied to the US military as well. So in some places, Pepsi became much more popular, like in Russia initially, because it was, even though it was a US company, it wasn't seen as emblematic of the United States as perhaps Coca-Cola was. I got to dig that map out. I haven't seen it for a while. I have it in an old lecture, but it's fascinating to think about the geopolitics of soda. I mean, that's something really interesting. Yeah,
totally. Also funny because like Pepsi's colors are literally, I mean, it's red, white, and blue, and
there's not even blue.
That's not an accident.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so they're both obviously trying to capture that. So let's really get into it. We're going to talk about regional pizza styles in the United States. This is where, for some listeners, it could get a little heated, but we'll do that after a short break.
Great. We will do our last ad break, and then we'll hit those regional pizzas.
And we're back. It's Geoff and Hunter. We're talking about Geography is Pizza on the Geography is Everything podcast. And we're about to go into regional pizza styles in the United States. So a lot of people from these places are very connected to it, or if they move somewhere else in the United States, they are looking for a slice similar to the slice that they knew in another part of the country. Geoff, do you have a favorite regional variety?
You know, I don't know if I have a favorite necessarily. I like all types. I would say I really like the sort of grab a slice and walk on the go. Yep. I guess that would be more like New York style pizza. That's probably what I eat most of. However, I will say that I really appreciate a good Chicago style deep dish as well. I think that to me, I would argue they are both pizzas.
Right.
But I would also say that they're both different enough that it's not an either or situation.
Right. They're pretty similar. What are you in the mood for kind of thing? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And then, you know, there's some variations, you know, I know California has some stuff going on.
Yep.
I would say I'm not as much of a fan of that kind of style of pizza or Hawaiian style. I'm not a pineapple. I don't care if people like pineapple on their pizza. It's just not for you.
That's good. That's very tolerant of you. I appreciate that. We're going to talk about some of those regions, and we're going to start with New York, okay? Because I think New York and Chicago are probably maybe best known, but there's other places as well. Around the turn of the 20th century, there was a lot of urbanization. There was, you know, the rise of industrialization in Southern Europe, and so a lot of people were moving to cities and then subsequently moving to other places. So a lot of immigrants from Southern Europe, including Italy, arriving in New York, you know, in the early 1900s, and many of them from Naples, you know, and other parts of Italy as well. And so New York pizza, I think, is pretty closely related to Neapolitan pizza. It's not the same, but it's somewhat reminiscent. Apparently, and of course, this is much debated, just like anything to do with pizza, but the first pizza place in New York, and perhaps well-known anywhere, documented, is opened in 1905 in New York. It was called Lombardi's. And so Lombardi's, it's supposed to be apparently the first. And it was likely that pizza was originally sold in street carts and more informally before this, but this is a place that sort of takes the documented crown of the first pizza place. And New York pizza is well known across the country. You can find New York style pizza in a lot of different places. It's maybe the best known regional variety. The pies are thin crust, although not as thin as traditional Neapolitan pizza. They're frequently sold by the slice. It's usually cut in very large triangular slices, and it's so large and floppy that sometimes it's easier to fold in half to eat, which sort of amplifies its ability to be taken on the go. And this was also made very famous in the opening sequence of Saturday Night Fever, starring John Travolta, where he's walking with the paint cans. He's working at a paint store. Spoiler alert, I won't say too much about it, but if you watch the beginning, he's doing that, and he gets a slice, or maybe it's two, folds it in half, and that's sort of setting the scene for what it's like to be a young Italian person in New York at this time. The crust is crisp, but it's still chewy. it's made from this high gluten flour. New York pizza is hand tossed traditionally, so it's not stretched out on a pan like they preferred that we do at Little Caesars, even though we like to hand toss it. But once you dropped one or two
That's
on
where
the
you gotta
ground,
like,
they'd be like, "Listen, you got it. You're wasting food here. You can't. Yeah, just put it in the
yeah.
pan." Unlike a traditional Neapolitan pie, New York pizza sauce usually has a few spices in it, so it's not totally plain. It's usually jazzed up with some kind of oregano, usually, or maybe some basil. And the
Mhm.
mozzarella is aged in low moisture. It's not the fresh mozzarella that's kind of moist, but rather the drier stuff that can be shredded onto the pizza or layered onto it. Also in New York, you can find Sicilian pizza, which comes in very thick, chewy crusted square slices, which is akin to, but not exactly like the pizza from Sicily. Now, I happen to be from a town in Connecticut that had a lot of immigrants from southern Italy and a lot from Sicily. So thick pizza was a thing there. I really liked it a lot. That's one of my favorite kinds of pizza. But there was also a place that sold Neapolitan, New York style pizza downtown where I lived, and I loved that place. The thin slice, it was delicious. So I
Absolutely.
early on I realized that you didn't have to just choose one kind of pizza.
It's funny because you brought up square cuts of pizza,
Yes.
and I've known people who have had strong opinions on whether square cut is okay or not, and like to them it was not okay.
Right.
There's no, and I'm like, it's just a shape.
Right. Yeah.
It's
It's
the
still a slice. I mean, a slice doesn't necessitate being triangular, I don't think. But yeah, some people, there's like, what am I going to, I'm not going to eat that. It's not a triangle.
right.
All right. So let's go into another region here. Another East Coast city with a very significant Italian population is New Haven, Connecticut. So
I was wondering
you
when
knew it was
Connecticut was
coming,
going
right?
to make an
I
appearance.
think
Yeah.
New Haven pizza has also experienced a pretty big national boost of attention in the last 5 or 10 years. So I think it's gotten more popular outside of New Haven. The pizza there is also very closely associated with the pizza from Naples. But New Haven style pizza is sometimes known as abit, which is a
Hmm.
term that was developed in New Haven by Italians speaking in Neapolitan dialect. And so it's spelled Apizza, but it's not a pizza, it's abit. And so this is
Oh,
like we
interesting.
have a place, a pizza Shoals
Yeah.
here in Portland, which is very good, by the way. And that's New Haven style pizza, basically.
I did not know. So I'm also familiar with a Pizza Shoals here in Portland. I did not know. I didn't know exact. I never really thought about where their name
Yeah,
came
what is
from,
that?
but I
Yeah,
was like, oh yeah, it's a pizza. It's yeah, okay. It's just like they're throwing a little extra flair on their
right.
pizza. That's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a little closer to the way it might be pronounced in Naples, probably a little bit different, but I think that's where it comes from. New Haven pizza is a little bit like New York pizza, but having said that out loud, I better immediately say how it's different. New Haven pizza dough is fermented longer than New York pizza dough and has a thin charred crust and is traditionally baked very quickly in extremely hot coal-fired ovens, which, like wood ovens, burn much hotter than ovens powered by gas or oil. And most of the ovens in New York City are now powered by gas or oil, but many of them in New Haven are still coal-fired ovens. And so this char is very distinctive to a beets. And people sometimes think it's burnt and they sort of get bent out of shape, like this is overdone, but it's not burnt. It's delightfully charred, you see. I mean, this is the
Mhm.
difference. So you should expect that if you're getting New Haven style pizza.
Yeah, so is this like one of those like brick oven pizza oven
Yes.
things? You kind of see the
Yeah.
sort of dome shape, and
Yeah.
it's like yeah, okay.
Yeah. And sometimes those are
I'm
they're wood burn, but traditionally it was coal burn because that was a very cheap and inexpensive source of energy at the early 1900s. And
mhm.
so that's what they were using.
I am very much a fan of the brick oven style pizza. I guess that's New Haven style.
I mean,
Didn't know
there are
that.
other styles that also use that, but New Haven is one of them,
Mhm.
let's say. Just because it's a clay oven or brick oven doesn't mean it's necessarily New Haven style, I should say.
Gotcha.
One style of New Haven pizza is called tomato pie, which has no mozzarella, but instead a dusting of pecorino romano. So it's a nice sort of like Parmesan-y kind of cheese, a hard cheese. You'll also find something called tomato pie, which is a little different in Philadelphia and Rhode Island as well. In Rhode Island, it's called bakery pie. So it's not exactly the same, but the feature is it doesn't really have mozzarella on it, which to some people, again, would be shocking and disappointing. But this is one of the styles that's out there. And another staple in New Haven is the traditional tomato and mozzarella pizza. So the originator of New Haven style pizza was a guy named Frank Pepe, who sold pizza from a street cart before he opened the now famous Pepe's in 1925. And one of Pepe's signature pizzas, which is now a signature pizza of New Haven, is the white clam pie. So this has olive oil, oregano, grated cheese, garlic, and fresh briny clams added on top, now synonymous with New Haven pizza.
Is this also with a white sauce instead of a
it's
sauce?
called white pizza, and it's basically an olive oil base, so it doesn't have red sauce.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
I've seen this before. I'm not a huge fan of it,
right?
But I'm also not a big fan of shellfish. So
yeah, if you don't like shellfish and you're not really down with clams, this might not be the choice for you. But it's actually quite good. In 1938, the also now famous Sally's Beats opened. And Modern Upbeats, which is also really well known, was founded in 1944. And they use an oil-fueled brick oven, which is a little different than some of the other places. But I will say that if you grow up in Connecticut, and I didn't grow up in New Haven, but I was not that far away from it. There's a huge raging debate, as far as I can remember, whether it's Pepe's or Sally's, and some people go with Modern, and people tend to have pretty strong takes on this. Like, it was obvious which one you should be picking, and it's one or the other. I think both Pepe's and Sally's have now expanded a little bit, so even outside of the state, it became so famous that they decided to franchise a little bit. There's another place called Bar, which opened in 91. It's a dance club. I think it's only 21 and over. It has some very well-reviewed pizza as well. Now, I'm just can't be drawn into this debate, however. I'm being from Connecticut. I don't want to alienate fans of any of these eateries. So I'm just going to have to play it on the fence and say that I love New Haven pizza. It's not the only kind I love. I love New York pizza as well. If we're in a conversation, if you hear me in a conversation with people talking about the best style of pizza, you'll probably hear me representing for New Haven and for New York. So I'd probably be in that camp. Yeah. Place identity, right? I mean, it seems like kind of a joke, but it's actually very important, and it's no joke. Geoff, I don't know if
to me, it's the core of what geography is, right?
Right? It is. It's the way that we feel about places. It's the way we identify with places. That's the kind of geography you and I are, I think, very particularly interested in. This is very timely. 2 days ago, which was Wednesday, or May 22nd, because we're recording on a Friday, a U.S. Representative Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut, so she's one of the members of the Congress from the delegation from Connecticut, read a statement into the congressional record that declared that New Haven has the best pizza in the country. To which the headlines in New York newspapers the next day was one of incredulity. It was like, how can this possibly be? How can anybody claim this?
I can only imagine.
And then to go even further, claiming that Connecticut is the pizza state.
Yeah, I can't imagine that would go over well with, New York. I can't imagine Chicago was probably pretty happy about it.
Jersey not happy either. Yeah.
Jersey not happy. I mean, there's probably a lot of places. This is one of those things where, again, people have such a, we talked a little bit about this, I think, on our episode last week about the Nile River. People like to have we're the best at this.
Right.
Like they like to assign to their place this, this idea that we're the greatest at something.
We're superlative, right? In some way.
Pizza.
Yeah.
Right. And pizza is one of those archetype arguments of, our pizza is better than yours, right?
Yeah.
We make the best pizza. It's not authentic,
right?
Unless it's
New
York style.
And the style. Yeah. So, I was thinking about how this was kind of an odd play, and I'm from Connecticut, and I've got the place identity thing, but it's a tough argument to make, I think, probably. So I was wondering what this was all about. So I did a little bit more digging, and it turns out that I think this is part of the Connecticut government's effort to rebrand itself, because Connecticut's not really famous for much other than New Haven pizza and the University of Connecticut basketball teams. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, from an outsider's perspective, I'm not from the East Coast. I'm very much situated here on the West Coast. I would say that Connecticut does fall in a little bit of an awkward area where the major that they sit basically, at least a large part of it, within the New York City metropolitan
Yep.
area, which is obviously more closely associated with the state of New York
That's right.
because it has it right there in the name. And then there's also like Boston and Massachusetts, which I would say in terms of New England holds the dominant cultural prominence, right?
I think
That's
that's
generally what people
accurate.
are going to think
Yeah.
about.
I think that your
And they don't
geographic
even,
imagination reflects what it was even
yeah,
like growing up there.
right. And they don't even, and then there's also Rhode Island there, but Rhode Island gets to also make the claim that they're the smallest state.
Right.
And so whenever somebody thinks of like the size of states or something, they're going to think of Rhode Island because Rhode Island's the smallest state. And while that might seem, kind of weird because nobody typically wants to be the smallest of something,
Right.
it still is it's almost like a cultural marker,
It's
right?
a
It's like
hook.
it's
Yeah.
a pinpoint, it's
Yeah.
a hook, right? And I do think Connecticut, again, outside looking in, does seem to lack that sort of cultural hook that these other states that surround it do have.
Well, that's exactly what's going on, I think, here. And so they're recognizing that, and they want to make it an appealing place for people to move to and for companies to move to and things like that. So I think this effort to be the pizza state, Connecticut is the nutmeg state. That doesn't resonate very strong. It's also the Constitution state, which is confusing because it had the first constitution of any state, but it's not the U.S. Constitution. So I think they're kind
Right.
of grasping about for something a little hipper, a little bit more of the times. And so I think pizza is maybe a vehicle for getting people to think about this place differently. And so we get the conflation of taste and place and emotion and food tied to place, tied to identity. So I think that's what's going on here.
I mean, it's probably a pretty smart play to me, to be honest.
And I'm certainly getting a reaction. Like there's no, bad news, right? Even if people are criticizing it, you're in
Right.
the news and people are talking about it. And so I think that's what they want. I could probably do an episode on New Haven pizza, but let's move on in interest of people wanting to learn about other places in the country that have pizza. And let's go to Chicago because you've mentioned that. It's pizza with a thicker crust, a chunkier sauce, and different sets of ingredients. The deep dish pizza is baked in a round pan with sides. So think like a cake pan, a pan you might use for making cake, instead of on a completely fat surface. So that causes some nice caramelization to sometimes happen on the side there. It's thick crust, but it's not heavy. It's light. It's buttery and flaky ideally. So it's a nice crust. Unlike New York pizza, is not as well suited to eating on the go. Some people use a knife and fork, which again is wildly controversial in some parts of the country to use that for eating pizza. But this is a pizza that might lend itself to that.
Right. I think I've had a Chicago slice where I was eating it like a slice, but it was a lot more cumbersome.
Yeah.
It's not as handheld as a New York slice, for
It's
example.
not as versatile on the go kind of thing. The style developed in the 1940s as soldiers were coming back from the war, as we talked about before. And apparently one of the main pioneers in Chicago pizza was actually a Texan named Ike Sewell, who opened Pizzeria Uno in 1943 with his pal Rick Ricardo. Not Ricky Ricardo, but Rick Ricardo, who had served in Italy during the war. And so he was talking about this phenomenon of pizza. And Sewell, being from Texas, said, well, I want to make it much bigger, because that's, I guess, a thing in Texas. And so they kind of went to the side from the Neapolitan style and started Pizzeria Uno, which has the thick slice. It's a chain with locations throughout the world now as well. There is some rumors and some speculation that somebody named Rudy Malnati, who is rumored to have actually created maybe that recipe, since none of those guys were actually chefs. He had a son named Lou, and Lou Malnati's opened in 1971. It's very well known in Chicago. And I will say this, though, and this is I think maybe surprising to some people, although I'm assuming very well known to people in the Chicago area, that even though nationally deep dish pizza is conflated with Chicago, that there's another variety there called tavern style pizza, which has a very thin rolled crust cut into squares. And this is reportedly very popular with people who live in Chicago versus those people who might be visiting the city and want to get a slice, they're going to get the deep dish. So apparently if you're an insider in Chicago, you know that there's the tavern style pizza.
As you're talking about I might get myself in some hot water here with Chicagoans.
Oh boy.
As you're talking about this person who from Texas, sort of was like, hey, I want to make this bigger. I want to, bring the style here. It kind of makes me think like, is this actually Texas style pizza?
Oh boy. There's some people, driving just got in accidents. Some people eating just dropped their forks on their plates.
I've just been canceled in Chicago, I think.
This is known as Chicago style pizza. We're going to go with that. Let's quickly move over to another industrial city, and that's Detroit. Because I think also Detroit pizza, which I didn't hear tons about in the past, has kind of made a name for itself. I know that we've got a place in Portland that advertises itself that way. And Detroit pizza dates back to the 1950s. It is it's a thick crust, not quite as thick as Chicago style, but thick. It's kind of focaccia-like, the crust, with lots of tomato sauce. It's rectangular rather than round because of the deep pan that it's baked in. The dough is relatively wet, which makes the crust somewhat airy. And the dough is akin to Sicilian pizza, which we talked about before in the New York context. Traditionally, you make a pizza in Detroit by adding the toppings first onto the crust, then the cheese, and then the sauce. And this apparently helps guard against the crust becoming soggy. I think that in many times the toppings are still put on top because people want to see what they are. When they've ordered something, they want to see their toppings are there. So that may have changed in some places. I don't know how universal that is. The cheese covers the crust itself. And so when it's baked in this pan, it crisply caramelizes, and it's really fantastic. Commonly, brick cheese from Wisconsin is used, and brick cheese is a distant softer cousin to cheddar made in Wisconsin. So there's a particular cheese that's supposed to be associated with it. The style was originated in 1946 by Gus Guerra. He started making pies in blue steel automotive pans frequently found in the car factories of Motor City. So obviously they cleaned it real well, and they're like, we can make a pizza in this. And it makes sense.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool. I don't know why that's so cool, but it's very cool. I don't know. It's just like such DIY. A neat idea.
Yeah. Like, what do we got very around DIY. Here? We got these pans. Well, let's make a pizza in it. He eventually opened Buddy's Pizza and subsequently Cloverfield Pizza in 1953. And then you have another place, Louis, that was started by a former employee of Buddy's. And I guess these are some of I don't know if they're the main places that people in Chicago and Detroit go, but they're well known. And then I also have to give a small shout out here to Little Caesars, which also began in Detroit. And I'm not sure this can be 100% could be considered Detroit style, but I guess when I was working at Little Caesars, I didn't identify as making Detroit style pizza. So maybe I was just underinformed.
It's kind of hard for any of the chains, really. It's kind of hard to assign a style to them because to me, they're all just it's just fast food pizza.
It's trying to be,
right? That's almost its own style.
It's trying to be universal. Right? Yeah.
Trying to be universal. They're just trying to, make the, a product that's, cheap and easy to make and is profitable and people want to buy.
Highly standardized. Yeah.
Yep.
And maybe, maybe similar to some of the competitors as well. Maybe that's part of it. All right, let's go into another one here. And after this, we'll go through them a little more quickly, but we'll spend a couple minutes talking about California pizza.
California pizza.
Very
familiar with it.
Well, being from really the heart of California pizza yourself originally, which is Southern California, although Northern California plays a role as well, became a discernible phenomenon in the early 1980s. I think that California pizza is less strictly defined than other regional variations and has more to do with ingredients, sometimes seasonal ones, many of which were not previously associated with pizza. So like maybe arugula or something like that, which, you maybe think of this as a salad green, but let's put it on pizza. California pizza tends to have kind of a thinner crust because it seeks to highlight the toppings that are on top of it. So that's easier to do with a thinner crust. Apparently, there are 3 chefs that are often named as being instrumental in this trend of California pizza: Ed Ladue, Wolfgang Puck, and Alice Waters. Alice Waters, I think, is a very famous chef, founded the well-known restaurant in Berkeley called Chez Panisse. And she began using ingredients like leeks and duck confit that she'd be using in other things, and she started using it on pizza. And that became really popular. Ed Ledoux made pizza with ingredients such as ricotta and pate in San Francisco. And then he was recruited by Wolfgang Puck to work at his West Hollywood restaurant Spago, which opened in 1982 and currently has locations in Beverly Hills and Las Vegas. And at Spago, they developed a pizza topped with smoked salmon, caviar, and creme fraiche, which I think is still a signature pie for this restaurant. Ledoux then went on to develop the menu at California Pizza Kitchen, that chain, which began in the 80s. So this is maybe what you're referring to. And they have dishes such as Thai chicken pizza, which I think has become a big seller for them.
Yeah, we used to call it the CPK. Just go to CPK.
Okay. See, again, growing up where I grew up in a different pizza realm, I didn't even know about this, maybe until I moved to California in the 90s or something.
I was never a big fan of California Pizza Kitchen. It was fine. It was not, I wouldn't say it was like that good. And I wasn't, again, like maybe I'm more of a traditionalist when it comes to pizza, but I'm like, I just kind of want like, some cheese and maybe some like, I don't know, olives and mushrooms or something like that. I'm very basic.
Yeah. No, I get that.
The Thai chicken is not, I'm not interested in Thai chicken on my pizza.
Yeah.
Little high concept. Yeah.
Many other chefs, of course, continue to develop California pizza, and particularly in the Los Angeles area. So we've got a little bit of time left. So let's go into the lightning round. And we're going to hit some different ones. And I don't know if you know of these or other people do, but let's go for it. Buffalo pizza. This pizza has a chewy crust with a profile in between New York and New Haven style pizza and that of the thick crust of Chicago or Detroit. It's got small rounds of pepperoni topping that curl up and pool a little oil in there, and they get charred during baking. So that's apparently a signature of Buffalo style pizza. There's St. Louis pizza. St. Louis pizza typically has a thick cracker-like crust made from unleavened dough. Maybe it's a thin cracker-like crust, and is topped with something called Provel, which is a white processed cheese mixing cheddar, Swiss, and provolone. It's very gooey, has a low melting point, and it was explicitly innovated apparently for pizza making in St. Louis. And the consistency of this cheese goes particularly well with this thin, crisp crust that it has. There's something called Colorado pizza. Do you know about this? This is Rocky Mountain pie. Is this a thing?
I mean, I know what Rocky Mountain oysters are,
right.
But I don't think this is the same thing.
That's something else. This is Rocky Mountain.
At least I hope so.
And not Rocky Mountain High, which would be the John Denver song, but Rocky Mountain Pie,
right.
Which has wide rolled crusts to corral the toppings. We've talked, but we should probably revisit just briefly the Hawaiian pizza, which has a whole history unto itself. Slices of pineapple and ham or Canadian bacon on top. I feel like this might be one of the most controversial regional variants of all. People seem to be pretty firmly for it or against it. I don't know if there's a lot of people who are dwelling in the in the middle on that one, but I'm sure those people are out there too. Geoff, do you know where Altoona is?
Sounds like it's from someplace in New York. I don't know.
It's close. It's in Pennsylvania, Altoona, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And from Altoona, Pennsylvania, we get a thick crust pizza with salami, green bell peppers, and American cheese, which dates back to the 60s or 70s.
This kind of sounds like if you go into, let's say you go into their frozen pizza section, there's always the Supreme, right?
Right. Okay.
And the Supreme has basically I think it has some sort of sausage on it. It has green bell peppers and I think it's American cheese as well.
So maybe this is where that comes from. Apparently, this dates back to the 60s or 70s when it was served exclusively at the Altoona Hotel until a fire forced its closure in 2013. And then suddenly other local restaurants started making it, and it became even more of a discernible thing. I mean, I dated somebody from Altoona in the 90s, wonderful person, but we never had the Altoona pizza conversation. So I don't know. You think it would come up in conversation, but it never did.
Yeah.
There's Quad Cities Pizza. And if you're not familiar with the Quad Cities, they are Davenport and Bettendorf, Iowa, and Rock Island and Moline, Illinois on the Mississippi River. It's a thin crust made a little nutty through the extra malt that's added into the dough, the malt extract. It features a spicy sauce, fennel sausage, lots of mozzarella, and it's cut into strips. So it's not squares. It's not triangles. It's strips.
Interesting. Okay. I'm not opposed to that.
No, it seems like
I think that might be fun.
Reasonable to eat something like that. And then
good for dipping if you're a dipper, you know?
And then finally, if you're in Miami, you might find some Cuban style pizza associated with the chain Ray Pizza has a thick, doughy crust, minimal sauce, and various toppings, and then a mix of mozzarella and Gouda cheeses on top. So,
oh yeah.
What I suspect is that if we were to look at countries throughout the world, we would find something similar. We would find regional variations of pizzas that differ from city to city or region to region, but that's going to have to be for another day.
Yeah. I mean, there's such a deep history of pizza just within the United States that this could have, like, I mean, we didn't even just talk about the United States here. We did a large part of it,
Right.
but like we could have easily just done the United States pizza.
That's right. I mean, I know Japan has a bunch of like interesting variations going on. There are a lot of countries that have embraced pizza because of how practical it is and how much people love it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, this was a really fun episode, Hunter. I really loved learning all about pizza. This makes me want to start thinking about like what's our next food type,
I know.
right? Because
yeah,
you know, I don't have one off the top of my head, but there's got to be another one because sushi was really fun. Now pizza was really fun. So we got to think of that. Let's go ahead and, well, tell us who you are and where we can find you.
Thanks, Geoff. I'm Hunter Shoby. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portlandness, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. And I'm co-host with you, Geoff, of this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Yeah, and my name is Geoff Gibson. I do other geography things online. You can find me mostly on YouTube over at Geography by Geoff. Go ahead and search on Google. I'm sure you'll find it. If you liked what you listened to today, you really had fun sort of learning all about pizza, the history, and sort of the geographic dispersion of it, go over to podcast or Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever app you use, and rate and review us. We really appreciate seeing those, and it's really fun sort of seeing those reviews come in. If you want this delivered straight to your email, you can. It's just over at geographyiseverything.substack.com. Totally free. You don't have to pay anything. I know Substack has a paid option. We don't do that. It's really just another way for you to get access to this. Next week, Hunter, we are going to turn our attention back to transportation.
Excellent.
And this is something that we've touched on a little bit here. In fact, we had a whole episode all about high-speed rail.
Okay, right.
Which was a lot of fun.
That was great.
People can go back and listen to that. Now we're going to turn our attention to just trains in general.
Specifically to trains. Are slow trains, fast trains, all trains. Yes.
Yeah, well, and it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be a lot more international than our pizza episode. I'm sort of redoing sort of how I was originally thinking of it, where we're actually going to look at how different train systems work and are managed around the world and sort of what they do.
Very
right? I mean, what we're going to find is that, there's differences in how the United States uses trains versus China versus Europe versus, all these other places, right? And that feeds into sort of the geographic sort of aspect of trains at large. We're also going to talk about some of the sort of longest train routes, which I think will surprise some people, because I know there's one very famous one that often gets touted as the longest train route, but it's not actually the longest train route. So you'll have to come back next week to learn all about that, though. So I guess until then, well, we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening.